My wife thought I was cheating on her with my assistant and slept with someone else out of spite. Today, destiny charged her the most expensive bill. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know where our community is growing. My story began more than 10 years ago in the hallways of high school. Back then, I was an introverted young man, and she was pure energy, a combination that seemed to balance my world. She was only 16 years old when we met. She wasn't the most popular, but she had a laugh that lit up the room and an extroverted spark that captivated me immediately. We met in a science class, and soon the walks after school turned into long talks about our dreams and the future we wanted to build together. What started as an innocent friendship quickly became the axis of my life. To our friends and family, we were the ideal example of young love, the couple everyone aspired to be. However, looking back, the warning signs were always there, although at the time I mistook them for romance. She showed flashes of jealousy that I, in my inexperience, attributed to the intensity of first love. If I talked to another girl, she would ask me with a smile that hid an inquisitive look. I thought it was something natural, something that time and maturity would take care of calming down. I didn't know I was ignoring the foundations of a distrust that would grow until it became suffocating. When we entered college, we decided to study in the same city, but in different faculties. I chose engineering and she administration. As the academic load increased and our social circles expanded, our time together decreased, and it was there that her insecurity began to professionalize. Every study meeting or project that kept me busy was met with suspicion and constant questioning. Despite these ups and downs, we both kept alive the idea of marriage as the ultimate goal. After graduating and getting stable jobs, we decided to take the big step, convinced that stability would finally calm her inner demons. But marriage was not the end of her doubts, but the beginning of a stage where her distrust would transform into a destructive force. The first years of marriage were, in appearance, the fulfillment of everything we had planned. We moved into our own apartment and began to build a life based on professional stability. However, the novelty of a shared home was soon overshadowed by the return of her old insecurities, now with a much more aggressive intensity. If I went out for a drink with my colleagues after an exhausting day, she would greet me with an interrogation. Who did you go with? How many women were there? Why did you prefer to be with them than with me? I tried to answer patiently, believing that if I was transparent, she would finally understand that I had nothing to hide, but my explanations only fed her need for control. Everything changed drastically when I received a promotion at the technology company where I worked. My boss assigned me a large-scale project that involved a change of office and a new team. I was excited. It was the opportunity one had been waiting for years. Upon arriving home and sharing the news, she feigned joy and prepared a special dinner, but I noticed a shadow of concern in her eyes. She told me that the new position would mean less time for us, and although I tried to reassure her, her mind was already beginning to manufacture scenarios where my professional success was a direct threat to our relationship. On the first day in the new office, I met who would be my assistant. She was a young woman, extremely professional and efficient. From the beginning, our relationship was strictly professional. We barely exchanged words that weren't about reports or meetings. However, I made the mistake of mentioning her at home as part of my new team. The atmosphere changed instantly. Do you think she's pretty? She asked me in a tone that pretended to be casual, but that dripped with venom. I answered with the truth that she was attractive, but that she was my wife and the only one who mattered to me. That answer, far from calming her, was the trigger that turned my days into a constant trial and my nights into a struggle to defend my integrity against ghosts that only existed in her imagination. As the project progressed, my life at home became a minefield. Every night, as I walked through the door, a tribunal awaited me. The interrogation about my assistant became a suffocating routine. Did you talk today? What did you talk about? Why did you laugh in that meeting? She wasn't looking for information. She was looking for a crack in my story, an inconsistency that would confirm the betrayal she had already taken for granted. The absolute transparency I offered, showing her my agenda, telling her about my meeting step by step became useless. In her mind, my honesty was just a well-constructed facade. The tension escalated to the point where sleeping in our own bed became impossible. After exhausting arguments that ended in tears and baseless accusations, I ended up spending entire nights on the sofa. I felt defeated. We had been together since we were 16, and now, at 29, I found myself defending my loyalty to the woman who should know me best. What hurt me the most was that she didn't see my dark circles from overwork, but assumed that my fatigue was the product of an affair. I was trying to save our marriage, but she was too busy looking for evidence of a crime I never committed. One Friday night, fate set a trap for me that she didn't take long to close. I left the office late, and due to a problem with public transportation, my assistant offered to give me a ride home. I knew it was a bad idea, but I was exhausted and wanted to get home soon to avoid another fight over my delay. The journey was short and strictly professional, talking only about pending tasks. However, as I got out of the car, I saw her silhouette in the window, watching us from the darkness of the apartment. I went in knowing I had just entered a war zone. That night the sofa was the least of my problems. What I saw in her eyes was not pain, but the twisted satisfaction of someone who finally believes they have the definitive proof to do something unforgivable. From that night on, the atmosphere at home changed in a disturbing way. There were no more screams or police interrogations. Instead, a glacial silence and a distance that chilled my blood set in. She stopped asking me about my assistant, and suddenly seemed not to care what time I arrived. However, I began to notice that now it was she who was arriving late. Her excuses were short and lacked details. I was with friends. Oh, work got complicated, but her body language betrayed her. She avoided my gaze and kept her phone always face down, taking it even to the bathroom. What I didn't know at that moment was that, under her twisted logic, she had already condemned me. In her mind, seeing me get out of my assistant's car was the moral authorization she needed to execute her plan of revenge. It wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a calculated decision to level a scale that she herself had tilted with her paranoia. The man she chose for her reprisal was not a stranger, but that ex-boyfriend from her youth whom she had talked so much about in the past. While I was sinking into depression, trying to understand her detachment, she was giving another man the intimacy she denied me out of pure spite. Suspicion became a physical certainty in my stomach. One night, she arrived almost at midnight with her hair slightly disheveled and an expression of fatigue that was not work-related. I tried to approach her, ask her what was happening with us, but she pushed me away with a coldness I had never known in her. "I'm tired of your doubts," she told me, using projection as a shield. She locked herself in the room, leaving me on the sofa again, realizing that the woman I had grown up with was transforming into a stranger who was planning my destruction while I slept under the same roof. The truth exploded one Saturday morning, in the most pathetic and careless way possible. She was taking a shower and left her phone on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, the device began to vibrate with an insistence that put me on alert. There were missed calls from a number that had no name, but that insisted as if it were an emergency. My first thought was that something bad had happened to her family, but when the screen lit up with a text message, the world stopped. The message said, "I can't wait for your husband to leave tomorrow, so you can come back to my bed. What we did last night was the best." I felt a cold void in my chest, a nausea that forced me to hold on to the edge of the table. At that moment, she came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, and her face transformed when she saw that I had the phone in my hand. There was no look of regret or an attempt at an apology. Instead, her first reaction was to attack. She yelled at me, called me an invader of her privacy, and with a cynicism that left me paralyzed, she blurted out her justification. "I did it because you're doing it first. I know what you have with that woman at the office." It was the height of manipulation. She was using her own paranoia to wash away her guilt. It was then that I understood that her distrust was never a disease, but her perfect excuse. She needed to turn me into a monster so as not to feel like a traitor for what she had just done. I didn't scream. There were no pleas. In absolute silence, I walked to my computer. I looked for the photo of my assistant's desk that she herself had sent me once to show off her office, and I put it in front of her eyes. In the image, my assistant posed smiling with her husband and her 2 young children. Nothing ever happened, I told her. I saw how her expression changed from hatred to pure terror. In that second, she understood that she had destroyed 10 years of life for a lie that she herself had invented. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. Watching her crumble as she processed the image of my assistant's family was the most bitter moment of my life. There were no more cries of revenge or accusations. Only the dead weight of her own betrayal remained. The divorce was finalized in record time. I didn't want to fight for anything material, not for the furniture we chose together, nor for the money saved. My only priority was to get out of my life the person who had been capable of destroying a decade of loyalty to level a lie. She moved in with her parents, taking with her the shame of having lost everything for a paranoia she herself had fueled. During the following months, I dedicated myself completely to rebuilding my own self-worth. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't have to give explanations for why I was late or who I was talking to. The office, which used to be a battlefield of suspicions, became my sanctuary of peace. My assistant continued to be the brilliant professional she always was, oblivious to the chaos that her simple existence had caused in the mind of an unstable woman. I achieved success in the project, and my career took off, proving to me that the problem was never my lack of time, but her inability to trust the man who gave her everything. However, despite having blocked her contact and cut every trace of our life together, the past came knocking on my door in the most unexpected way. I found out through mutual acquaintances that she was not enjoying her new life. Apparently, the man she left me for, that ex-boyfriend from her youth, disappeared as soon as the drama became reality. She was left alone, facing the judgment of her own family and the weight of her conscience. I was healing, but she was trapped in the echo of her own decisions, realizing too late that the enemy was never me, but her own inner demons. Months had passed since we signed the papers. My life finally had its own rhythm, far from the constant surveillance and the weight of suspicions. I had blocked her number and any means of contact, determined that our 10-year chapter would be sealed forever. However, one Tuesday afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I noticed several missed calls from an unknown number. I didn't pay them any mind until a text message arrived. "Please, don't block me. I need to tell you something that's killing me. It's about what happened." I deleted the message immediately. There was nothing she could say that would change the fact that she had betrayed me for a lie. But she didn't give up. When I arrived at my building, I saw her. She was sitting on the front steps, her shoulders slumped, and an expression that had no trace of the arrogance with which she had yelled at me months ago. When she saw me, she quickly stood up, as if she had been waiting for that moment for hours. My first impulse was to turn around and leave, but something in her gaze, a mixture of absolute defeat and shame, made me stop a few meters away. "You shouldn't be here," I told her with a coldness. She didn't try to get closer. With a trembling voice, she confessed that by a twist of fate, she had run in my assistant at a casual event. Without the other woman knowing who she was, they struck up a brief conversation. In those few minutes, she heard from my assistant's own mouth how happy she was with her husband, how much she loved her children, and how she always spoke of her boss, me, as an upright and professional man. At that moment, I felt like the ground was opening up. She whispered. I realized I destroyed the most valuable thing I had for a ghost I myself had invented. Seeing her there, admitting that her revenge was the biggest mistake of her life, didn't give me the satisfaction I expected. It only gave me a deep pity for the lost time. I stood in silence, watching her as tears began to roll down her cheeks. Months ago, seeing her like this would have broken my heart, but now I only felt an insurmountable distance. Hearing that she had finally accepted reality, that my assistant was innocent and that I had always told her the truth, didn't fix anything. The damage was not in the misunderstanding, but in what she was capable of doing while she believed in her own lie. Her betrayal was not a mistaken judgment. It was a conscious choice to hurt me in the deepest way possible. "And what do you expect me to say?" I asked her with a calm that seemed to disarm her. She began to apologize desperately, saying that she would give anything to turn back time, to go back to that day when she decided to look for her ex-boyfriend and erase every one of her actions. She told me that since she found out the truth, she couldn't sleep, that the guilt was consuming her, and that she just wanted a chance to show me that she could be the woman I fell in love with in high school again. But I no longer recognized that woman. The person in front of me was someone who had preferred revenge over communication. I told her that forgiveness was something she should seek for herself, because I no longer had anything to grant her. "I forgave you the day I signed the divorce, but that doesn't mean I want you in my life," I declared. I explained that trust is like a crystal that once shattered can be glued back together, but it never becomes transparent again. She had decided to break that crystal with all her might. Seeing that my words were firm and that there was no room for reconciliation, she hung her head. She understood that although she now had the truth, she had forever lost the man who loved her unconditionally for more than a decade. I turned around and entered the building, leaving behind the echoes of a story that no longer belonged to me. I heard her footsteps moving away from the entrance, but I didn't stop to look back. However, what happened just a few seconds later broke the silence of the street and forced me to turn around. She came out of the building completely beside herself, her gaze clouded with tears and her shoulders shaking with desperate sobs. In her state of absolute confusion and remorse, she seemed to have lost her connection with reality. She walked hastily, as if trying to escape her own guilt. From the entrance, I watched in horror as she reached the edge of the sidewalk and, without stopping for a second to look at the traffic, crossed the street. The sound was deafening, the screech of brakes trying to stop an inevitable impact, followed by a dull thud that chilled my blood. The vehicle couldn't avoid her. She was thrown several meters before falling onto the pavement. The image of her lifeless body on the asphalt instantly erased any trace of resentment I might have had. I ran towards her as people began to surround the scene, and sirens could be heard in the distance. When I reached her side, the scene was heartbreaking. She was unconscious, and the blow to her head was obviously serious. The ambulance arrived minutes later, and she was rushed to the nearest hospital in critical condition. I spent the next few hours in a white, cold waiting room, the same place where we once planned a future, but now waiting for life or death news. The doctor finally came out with a guarded prognosis. The impact on the skull had caused a severe brain trauma. There she was, trapped in a hospital bed, paying too high a price for a mistake that was born of paranoia and ended in tragedy. With trembling hands, I took out my phone and looked for the numbers I hadn't dialed in months. I called her parents. Hearing their voices filled with surprise and then pure terror as I gave them the news was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I told them she was in serious condition, that she had had an accident in front of my building, and that they should fly to the hospital immediately. As I waited for their arrival in the sterile hallways, time stretched in an agonizing way. Every minute felt like an hour, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the weight of memories of a life that no longer existed. Her parents arrived at the hospital almost 3 hours later, with distraught faces and their breath cut short by anguish. We barely had time to exchange a couple of sentences when the on-call doctor came out of the intensive care unit. His expression said it all before he uttered a single word. He informed us that the intracranial pressure due to the blow had been devastating. Despite surgical efforts, her body had not resisted. Just as they entered the room to try to see her, she took her last breath. She died right there, surrounded by the cries of her parents, without having been able to regain consciousness to say a last word. I stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as the life of the woman I grew up with was extinguished for good. There was no triumphant farewell, no reconciliation, no new beginning, just an abrupt and tragic end born of a chain of bad decisions. Seeing her parents clinging to her lifeless body broke me inside, not for the love we once had, but for the waste of a life that could have been beautiful. I left the hospital in the middle of the night, walking in the rain, knowing that the chapter of our story had closed forever, leaving behind a void that no explanation or regret could ever fill. The burial was a small ceremony. Under a persistent rain, I watched as they lowered the coffin that was my world for more than a decade. Her parents could barely look at me. In their eyes was a mixture of infinite pain and the bitter awareness that their daughter had died, chasing a forgiveness that came too late. I stayed in the background like a spectator of a tragedy that no longer belonged to me, feeling that with each shovelful of earth, a part of my youth that would never return was also being buried. However, fate still had one last score to settle. As I was leaving the cemetery, I found out what had become of the guy she decided to take her revenge with. Life was not kind to him after the scandal. His reputation as an opportunist finally caught up with him. He lost his job after being involved in shady dealings and was left alone, rejected by the same social circle that once celebrated him. They told me that he now lives mired in absolute decay, carrying the indirect guilt of having been the instrument of a tragedy that ended in death. His one-night victory turned into a life sentence, being remembered only as the man who helped destroy a family in exchange for nothing. In the end, there were no winners. The emptiness in my chest was still there, but now it was accompanied by absolute clarity. I got into my car and drove away from that place, leaving behind the echo of the cries and the shadow of betrayal. For the first time in a long time, there were no paranoias, no lies, and no scores to settle. The price of truth was devastating, but the cycle had finally closed.